Shelley Stoops, who was the first specialist sex worker, independent sexual violence advisor and pioneer of the Merseyside model, will now talk through some case studies which illustrate why National Ugly Mugs is so important and how it can save lives.
Hi there, I'm Shelley Stoops and I'm going to talk to you about a case that I worked on in Liverpool in 2009. We're going to talk about a man called Matthew Byrne. Matthew Byrne was the manager of a local children's charity. He was also a very high profile person in Liverpool, linked in with lots of very important people. He was also very high profile in terms of child sex offences and advising government on child abuse victims, etc. And he was also, sadly, a serial sex offender with an unhealthy interest in children. The reason Matthew Byrne came to our attention was we had a series of ugly mugs came into our project. The first one was what we call a third-party ugly mug, where a woman stopped us on the street on outreach one night and told us about an assault that she'd been subjected to, where she'd been hung up on a chain and whipped by a man to the point where she'd needed 40 stitches in her legs. Clearly this disturbed us and we advised her to make a formal report to the police. But because she was in withdrawal from heroin, she clearly was in no state to do so. But we submitted the information as third-party reporters, and it just fed into the system and sat there, and nothing happened at that time. The next thing that came along was 5 or 6 months later, when another woman made a very similar report, but with more violence that was involved, including being tied up in what she described as a torture chamber, and sexually assaulted this time. However, she did want to make a formal report to the police. So that was enabled with our police liaison officer, and she did just that. The next thing that happened is I have a very good friend who is the manager of a project in Coventry for street sex workers, who rang me to say that she'd had some very strange ugly mugs reported to her, describing very, very similar offender and very similar MO, and women being taken to a torture chamber in Liverpool. Now, it's very, very unlikely that you would have people being taken, street sex workers being taken from Coventry, attacked in Liverpool and then taken back to Coventry, because it's a very large distance. We're talking about a round trip of something like 500 miles. But indeed, it was true, and that's exactly what happened. So she sent me over her cases, anonymised, of course, to protect the client's confidentiality, and they looked very much like the offences we had. Sadly, her police were not interested in taking those cases forward, and we passed them on to Merseyside Police, who were very happy to look at all of the cases together. Events overtook us really because, unbeknown to us, Matthew Byrne was also committing other sexual offences in terms of outraging public decency, where he was masturbating on the train to young school children and taking pictures of them whilst they were alone in train carriages. So his image had been displayed on all trains around the country, and he was apprehended getting off a train at Lime Street Station in June of 2009. When the police went to his house, it was clear that this was linked to the attacks on sex workers that they'd heard about on briefings. So the case was then handed over from BTP to Merseyside Police, and investigation was begun. We only had obviously 48 hours to either charge him or release him, and an investigation was very fast-paced, shall we say. So colleagues were dispatched to Coventry to get all the women who'd made ugly mug reports statemented, to get them to do ID parades and to confirm the identity. While that was going on, we were doing exactly the same thing in Liverpool, tracing the women who'd made ugly mug reports, getting them to give statements and also getting them to do ID parades. Every single woman came forward and gave a full statement. Some statements took 9-10 hours to complete, and nobody slept for 48 hours. In the early hours of the Monday morning, Matthew Byrne was charged with 35 offences in the initial stages. So we went on several months later, but as the time went on in those early weeks, we were getting an average of 1 DNA profile a day in the first couple of weeks being found in his property, usually blood, because he'd been whipping the women and the blood was spraying all over the walls, the ceiling, etc. And it was indeed, as the women have described, a torture chamber. But this is, happily for us, a job that only comes along once in a lifetime, but for the women it's something that they will never forget. He was taken to court and received a 3.5-year sentence, which kind of is very hard still to believe. But along with that sentence was attached an IPP. So we're hopeful that the IPP will add some gravity to that sentence. But this is all because one ugly mug came along in the beginning and relied on the chance factor of my colleague Lorraine in Coventry and I knowing each other. Ugly mugs should not be left to chance, and offenders who travel, like Matthew Byrne, should not be left to roam the country free to attack at will. I suspect that that is not the full story of Matthew Byrne's offending, and we'll never know just exactly the extent of his offending behaviours. We need a national ugly mug scheme to be able to pass this information to the serious crime analysis section, who have researchers who are dedicated to putting all the information together so that they can look at building the picture, and so that no woman ever slips through the net again, and offenders like Matthew Byrne cannot get away with committing these offences at will.
And it's hoped that'll stop men like Neil McMillan. 3 years ago, he raped a sex worker in Brighton. Just weeks later, he murdered this young woman. Andrea Waddell was working as a prostitute at the time. He was her client.
In 2009, a sex worker named Andrea Waddell was murdered by a guy called Neil McMillan. 6 weeks earlier, McMillan had raped another sex worker. She had reported the rape, however, the DNA sample had not yet been sent off for analysis. Also, had we had an ugly mug scheme in existence at the time, we may have been able to get the information about this rape out to other sex workers in the area, and Andrea may have been appraised and been able to refuse McMillan's booking, therefore being able to maybe prevent the violence that was put upon her and took her life. Andrea's parents at the time said that more needed to be done to protect sex workers. We hope that they would be happy with what National Ugly Mugs is now doing today, giving sex workers the tools to keep themselves safe. In 2004, Darren Johnson and a gang that he led murdered a sex worker by the name of Nipan Trakhanna. Johnson and his gang targeted a series of sex workers across London where they carried out violent assaults and robberies because they knew that the sex workers they were targeting would not report to the police. This enabled them to carry out a series of robberies which escalated in their violence until ultimately it ended in Nipan's death. These people don't just target sex workers, they target other people in the community not involved in the sex industry. If we look at 3 classic examples of people who targeted sex workers and non-sex workers. We begin with the case of Ronald Castry. Ronald Castry murdered a schoolgirl named Leslie Molseed in the 1970s. This case led to one of the most famous miscarriages of justice involving a man called Stefan Kishko. Stefan went to prison for Leslie's murder until ultimately advances in DNA found that he couldn't be responsible. He was released from prison and died shortly afterwards. Still, Ronald Castry got away with the crime for many, many years until he was pulled in for a rape of a sex worker in Leeds. When they ran his DNA against the database, they found that he was responsible for Leslie Molseed's murder. He's now serving a life sentence for that murder, but sadly he was not prosecuted for the sex worker rape. Another case was the case of Michael Sams. Michael Sams murdered a street sex worker in Leeds again. Leeds seems to be a particularly dangerous place for sex workers, named Julie Dart. A year later, after he'd murdered Julie, he kidnapped the estate agent Stephanie Slater and subjected her to a horrific ordeal of violence. Another more recent case would be that of Peter Chapman. So Peter Chapman's offending history began with what we would call now child sexual exploitation, the rape of what was then called teenage prostitutes in Newcastle. He served a prison sentence there and was released to Liverpool, where he went on a spree of rapes and sexual violence across the city, targeting the street sex workers. Some period after this, Chapman then went onto the internet and befriended a lonely, vulnerable young woman by the name of Ashley Hall. He subsequently made arrangements to meet with Ashley and murdered her. He's now known as the Facebook killer. These 3 cases clearly demonstrate that the offenders are not just targeting sex workers, but are a danger to everybody in our community. National Ugly Mugs is a tool that keeps everybody in our communities safe.